Hey there. I'd like to tell you a little bit about George Washington, the man on the dollar bill. I want to tell you what you need to know about George Washington in order to do well on the New York State Regents. So, let's begin. The first thing, obviously, and you already know this, is that George Washington is important because he is the first president of the United States. There he is, first president. And as the first president, he set many precedents. The president is the person who is in charge of the executive branch of our government. It's what Barack Obama is right now, and George Washington was the first one. A precedent, however, is an example. And I want to tell you some of the examples that George Washington set for our country. And they're still followed today. And you can think about a precedent, an analogy for this would be if you think about the seniors in your high school and the examples that they set for students. So maybe in the high school I went to, the seniors all drove to school, and they would also leave campus for lunch, leave the school for lunch. So that was an example that the seniors set. But maybe in your school, the seniors set an example about going to college, and they apply for college and they go to college. Well, George Washington, just like seniors, set many examples. We don't call them examples, though. We call them precedents. So that's definitely worth remembering. So the first precedent example set by George Washington was that he appointed advisors. He appointed advisors to serve in his cabinet. And now we're not talking, obviously, a cabinet like the cabinet you find in the kitchen. This is a cabinet. It's a team of advisors. It's a team of people who advise the president on issues ranging from national security to the budget to everything in between. And George Washington, as the first president, had the first cabinet. And the questions that kind of come up about the cabinet are this idea that the cabinet is part of the unwritten Constitution. You should totally write that down right now. Unwritten Constitution. So we know what the Constitution is. The Constitution, say it. The Constitution is the rules of government. It's the document that establishes the rules for the American government, how the American government works. And in it, it says the president can do this, and Congress can do this, and the judicial branch can do this, and this. It doesn't say that the president needs to have a cabinet. But every president has had a cabinet, and so we say that that is part of the unwritten Constitution. It's not actually written, but it has become more of a tradition, so to speak, a custom. So the question often asked is, what part of what action taken by George Washington is now part of the unwritten Constitution, and the part of that is appointing advisors or the cabinet. So smart guy, he knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed advisors to help. The second precedent or example, let's keep that up there for our reference. Precedent is an example. It sounds like president, but it's not. Example is the two-term limit. And President George Washington served for 2 terms. How long is a presidential term? That's right, 4 years. And if you serve for 2 terms, you multiply by 2, and you get 4 times 2 equals 8 years. So he served for 2 terms, and he stepped down after 2 terms. And the thing was, at the end of his 2 terms, everybody was like, George Washington, you're the man. We want you to be president forever. George Washington was worried that if he didn't step down, though, or this is how the story goes that I heard, that he would become his worst nightmare, and that's a king. He didn't want to be a king. He rebelled against the King of England. He just wanted to be president, and he didn't want to be president for even that long. So he stepped down after 2 terms, after 8 years. He said, you know what, that's enough. If I'm president any longer, it'll be like I'm a king, so I'm stepping down. And every president after George Washington followed that example, followed that precedent, except for one, FDR, who we will talk about later. Let's keep going. So 2 precedents set by the president, his cabinet, and his 2-term limits. Now the next piece is when George Washington was stepping out of office, when he was done being president after his 8 years, he gave a speech. And in his speech, the speech is called the farewell address. And in his farewell address, farewell means bye. So in his farewell address, he was saying goodbye to the nation, and he wanted to sort of summarize the key points of his presidency. And the key points were basically the two-term limit, the advisors, and also about also a piece I'm about to get to next. So George Washington loved the federal government. I heart the federal government. And that says heart federal government because George Washington loved the federal government. You have to understand that many of his policies, many of his actions were taken to strengthen the federal government. And two things that he talked about in his farewell address that were aimed at strengthening the federal government and that are also precedents that he left for the country, examples that he set for the country, are the following. 1, neutrality. What word do you see in neutrality? That's right, neutral. Neutral means not taking sides. So if you think about it, you may have, maybe you've been in this situation where one friend says one thing about another friend to you, and then the other friend comes to you and says something else, and they want to split you, and they want you to choose. Oh, you need to choose me, you need to choose me, that person's so annoying. And it puts you in a very uncomfortable situation. So option 1, you could side with friend A. Option 2, you could side with friend B. Or option C, you could not take sides and you could remain neutral. And that's what George Washington thought we should do in our country. Of course, he wasn't talking about friends. He was talking about France and England. And at this time, and we're talking the late 1700s, so at this time, France and England were in a war. They were always fighting each other, they hated each other, and they wanted us to step in. They wanted the United States to step in. And France was like, oh, you should join us. And England was like, oh, you should join us. George Washington said, nope, we're going to be neutral. We are going to follow a policy of neutrality. Another important vocab word here is isolationism. Isolationism. Isolationism has the word isolation in it, which means minding our own business. George Washington was saying that when France and England came to us and like, you need to join one of us. He's like, we're going to mind our own business. We're going to be isolated from England and France. It's like when the two friends come to you in the lunchroom, and they're like, you need to pick a side, and you just want to kind of maybe go to a different table, maybe isolate yourself at a different table, and not deal with England and France. Because England, she's crazy, and France, he's totally crazy. So we want to stay away from them. And really, the reason that George Washington wanted us to stay away from France and England was that he thought we weren't strong enough. We were a brand new country. England and France were huge empires. They had really powerful militaries. And he thought, you know what, let's stay away until we get a little bit stronger. So that was the third precedent. Remember, we have cabinet, we have 2 term limits, and then we have neutrality or isolationism. One of the terms you might hear on the test about neutrality is this notion of entangling. Let's see if it'll fit here. Entangling. So, entangling alliances. Entangling, let's think about what that sounds like. Entangle, to entangle. Entangle is to get mixed up. Entangle is to get tangled up. Oops. George Washington thought that we should not get into entangling alliances, and that's actually the wording that he used in his farewell address. He said, no entangling alliances. And so when you see the quote, no entangling alliances, you need to know entangle is getting mixed up, like mixed up between friends who are fighting, and alliances is when you team up, right? So France wanted us to make an alliance with them. They wanted us to team up with them, A-L-L-I-A-N-C-E, and the plural obviously put the S at the end. And England wanted us to make an alliance with them, but we're not going to make alliances at all, according to George Washington. He didn't think we should be in an entangling alliance. He didn't think we should get involved. He thought we should be neutral. He thought that we should be isolationists. He thought we should sit at our own lunch table. So that was precedent number 3. The next piece is this notion of political parties. And you can think about the political parties today. There are the Democrats and the Republicans. There weren't always the Democrats and Republicans. There used to be the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. We're just going to abbreviate it Feds, but it stands for Federalists. And the Federalists wanted a strong federal government. They wanted a strong central government. And the Anti-Federalists wanted a strong state government. And George Washington, remember, he loved the federal government, and so many of his policies were meant to strengthen the federal government. But one thing that even though he was a strong Federalist, he thought political parties were a terrible idea. Because he thought that if we had political parties, our political system would degenerate. He thought that political parties would just argue with each other and actually not get anything done and put their own interests ahead of the state, ahead of the country's interests. Crazy idea, right? Like, that doesn't happen ever. Just kidding. So let's just quickly sum up. There are three main points and 2 subpoints. So first, George Washington was the first president. He set many precedents. One precedent was to have advisors or cabinet, which became part of the unwritten Constitution. Okay. Second, 2-term limit. He didn't think you should serve for more than 8 years. He thought that would make you a king. So he served 2 4-year terms. 2 times 4 is 8. He served 8 years, and then he went bye-bye. And before he went bye-bye, he gave his farewell address, in which he said no to entangling alliances. Entangle is to get mixed up. Alliances are teams. He didn't want us to get mixed up on France's team or England's team. He thought that would be a terrible idea. So he said we should have a policy of neutrality. So he set the precedent of a policy of neutrality. Another word for that is isolationism. It's to isolate yourself in the lunchroom. He didn't want us to cross the Atlantic. He wanted us to stay away from France and England, just stay on our own continent, mind our business. And finally, he also warned us about political parties because he saw the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists putting their interests ahead of the country's interests. He said that was a terrible idea, no to political parties. So that's George Washington, and I'm going to make it rain.